Okay, so today I'm going to be presenting on the impacts of housing insecurity on development in middle adulthood. And the reason I chose this subject is because in my internship this semester, I'm working with the homeless population primarily, and and a lot of them are in middle adulthood. So I was learning a lot about that this semester, and I had a lot to say about it. And I also wanted to learn more about it as I'm working with these people. So, middle adulthood is defined by Britannica as the stages from 40 to 60 years old. I didn't find much variation in that definition from other sources. And as far as the textbook says, a couple different theories. The psychosocial lifespan theory by Erickson. Middle adulthood is the stage of generativity versus stagnation. So, with generativity, it's the idea of contributing to other generations or to further greater society, essentially. And stagnation is failure of that generativity. So maybe you're not not yet in that stage when you should be, or you're just unable to meet the generativity development stage. In Levinson's Seasons of Adulthood theory, he describes these transitions in age to middle adulthood. So it's not like an immediate thing, but it's like a steady transition. So the ages of 40 to 45 is the transition out of is the stage into middle adulthood, and from 60 to 65 is the transition out of middle adulthood. And these developmental transitions are dependent on a lot of intersectional variables in different periods there. So some background info on middle adulthood. You have some biological changes like physical appearance, mobility, and reproductive health. So during middle adulthood, you could see some wrinkling. You could see, increase in gray hairs. Maybe your joints are kind of degenerating a little bit, so it's harder to move certain ways. And menopause usually happens around this period of time in adulthood. The commonality of chronic illness usually increases. So, we see a lot of people with chronic back pain, certain chronic pains, things like that, and other chronic illnesses like type 2 diabetes can develop during this period. It's very common. Cognitive functioning, studies have shown that during your middle adulthood, you have an increase in vocabulary, as you continue to live in society and you're learning those things. Verbal memory is still pretty high, spatial orientation and inductive reasoning. But then they found that there's a decrease in math skills and visual processing. So your vision is kind of degenerating at this stage. Mature coping mechanisms versus immature coping mechanisms. So this is something that the textbook talked about. During young and middle adulthood, you're supposed to be kind of letting go of those immature coping mechanisms and growing into those mature coping mechanisms. And some of those mature coping mechanisms are altruism, healthy humor, just abilities to cope in ways that are not damaging. And these unhealthy coping mechanisms are things like acting out, or maybe committing crimes, or things like projection and dissociation, loss of reality, fantasies, things like that, unhealthy coping mechanisms. But something that I've learned in working with people who are housing insecure at this age is a lot of times, especially the ones who are chronically homeless, they have a lot of trauma that stagnates this transition into having mature coping mechanisms, and a lot of them still exhibit these behaviors that are signs of immature coping mechanisms because they're kind of stuck mentally at a certain age. So that's something that I've noticed. And this whole slide is information from the textbook. Housing insecurity. So with that, homelessness is just being without a permanent place of residence. Eviction, if you're leasing property and you can't pay, you're asked to leave. And there's a legal process for that. Foreclosure, you can't pay your mortgage for whatever reason, and the bank takes back that estate essentially. And housing insecurity has a lot of impacts on development because it's a display of instability of a basic need. And when you have an instability of a basic need, it hinders your ability to develop the way that you should because you are constantly in survival mode. So studies have shown that housing insecurity is met with things like food insecurity, unemployment, inconsistent income, poor health conditions. They kind of all go hand in hand. They're all related to each other. It's a very multifaceted issue. So with the ecological perspective, there's a lot of things in the environment that can affect why someone is homeless. And that's why there are certain services that don't work for certain people because everyone's situation is different. But the US actually has one of the highest rates of homelessness of developed countries. And the possible environmental factors for why someone is homeless, like in the macro sense, is there's a lot of funding cuts on government programs that assist the homeless, especially right now. There's a lack of affordable housing for low-income individuals. The criminalization of poverty in public policy. So if you have charges for sleeping on a bench, some places will arrest you if you're for like loitering, and you have to pay those fees, and that doesn't help affording food or being able to find housing that you can afford. So that's a problem. Lack of access to employment and healthcare. So things like economic recessions are going to further hinder someone from being able to be employed. And then affordable healthcare. So healthcare is kind of a big reason that a lot of families become homeless because they have these really expensive medical bills and have to pay those versus the mortgage on their house or their rent. And so a lot of times that contributes to temporary homelessness for them. And a lot of times families are quicker to bounce back than individuals who are homeless because they usually have some kind of support system. But that's not always the case. Everyone's different. So economic recessions contribute a lot. Programs that are offered locally. In some places, there's not a lot of programs for people who are homeless that can help them get back on their feet. And that can contribute to why someone is homeless. They don't have resources. And by resources, I mean programs or a social support system like family, or that they can fall back on, or even friends that they can stay with, or that can give them shelter so that they can worry about these other things like employment. So there's a lot of reasons from the ecological standpoint why housing insecurity is a big issue. As far as the strength-based perspective, this article by Schneider and these other researchers that I found, they say that positive self-image and self-esteem and this ability to have hope is a big portion in overcoming homeless, or it's like it really helps people play a part in overcoming homelessness. And this is something we use in my internship when we do these assessments to see what services they need. We do assess their strengths, so we ask them, like, what do you like about yourself, or what are things that you're good at, what do people like about you, and then we use those, we kind of hone in on those and utilize that to help them see, like, you can use this strength that you have to take this step forward, to take these steps towards finding a place or applying for this funding or disability, things like that. From the strengths-based perspective, This is also something that Schneider kind of was, this idea that she was talking about was oppression is largely perpetuated by negative attitudes and stigmas towards a certain people group applied to systemic structures. And this is like a big idea in the strengths-based perspective. And these attitudes that the homeless are weak or subhuman really obviously affects their self-esteem and worth, and can contribute to their abilities to get out of homelessness. So some statistics on housing insecurity with as far as race and ethnicity. So this is a chart showing the by race and ethnicity, the number of people who are experiencing homeless per 10,000 people in the population. So you have Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander, like very high. American Indian is number 2, and African American comes in at number 3. So they're the third highest rate of homelessness. And then people who are mixed, Hispanic, then white and Asian are the lowest, have the lowest rates of homelessness. And this is also in proportion to the population in the country. Statistics on housing insecurity and gender. So this is increases in homelessness per gender identity. And something I want to kind of hone in on here is transgender individuals, because it's a really, really big issue, and it's become harder as the current administration has kind of created laws or taken away certain protections for transgender individuals. And so many of the transgender individuals who are homeless are unsheltered because of these discriminatory laws that are made, which I will get into in just a second. And then there's this equal access rule that the U.S. Department of Federal Housing and Urban Development created that protected transgender homeless people by saying that they could go to the shelter of their preferred sex or gender identity. And in July 2020, there's a modification to it made that essentially sent that decision back to individual shelters as long as it wasn't illegal in their state. So they could say that if you were a transgender female, that you couldn't stay in the women's shelter, you had to go in the male shelter. And it's very dangerous in those situations because a lot of times, especially transgender females, will get severely beaten in men's shelters, which I've actually had the situation happen to me recently in my internship where we had that happen. And we had to go into crisis mode. It was really bad. And a lot of times these transgender individuals do prefer to be on the street at night and be unsheltered because it is just as dangerous for them in a shelter. And North Carolina, unfortunately, does not have those specific protections in place, so the shelters are able to discriminate against them. And over the past 4 years, transgender homelessness has obviously increased at an alarming rate. And so here's some more statistics that I have. Couldn't find the percentage of the homeless, specifically 40 to 60, but I did find 31 to 61. So we do have people on the younger end of middle age, mostly, who are homeless. So in that 31 to 50 range is 35%, and then 51 to 61 is on is about 15.5%. So within the middle age group, you will find more people who are in that 40 to 50 range. So 62% of the homeless individuals are individuals, and 38% are part of families who are homeless. And while 79.3% of those in homeless families are female, only 37.2% of the total homeless population is female, and then they're mostly male. About 16% of the homeless population is chronically homeless. So that means a lot of times that they are very mentally ill. And a lot of these people are in and out of hospitals. They're what you call frequent flyers in hospitals, in and out of jail, and they've just been on the streets for years and they don't really know anything else. And I have a lot of those clients. And according to the textbook, it's actually more affordable to provide stable housing for these people who are chronically homeless than for them the cost of hospital visits constantly. Because I have some clients, like I've heard some be in like 80, 90 times. Like that is so common among so many of them a year. And so 13% of the homeless are veterans, and a lot of them are also very mentally ill, like have very severe PTSD, things like that, that has contributed to their homelessness. So in the code of ethics, our responsibility is obviously that we advocate for basic human needs of others so that these people can develop correctly and be in the right place in life that they need to be at or are expected to be at. And as of 2019, though, we have a huge deficit in beds for temporary housing, so there's not enough for the homeless people, and so a lot of them end up on the streets, and that's dangerous. And while we have generally enough beds for families in most places, enough shelter for them, the deficit really lies in the individual piece of homelessness. And while there's a lot of permanent housing programs that have actually increased in capacity by 20% in the country recently, these emergency or temporary housing beds or temporary emergency shelters have actually decreased their capacity by about 9%. And while that doesn't sound like much, with the deficit we have, that's bad. And so we need to be advocating for those temporary beds numbers to not go down, especially as winter months come, and it's way more dangerous. It's a matter of life and death if these people are on the street because it's so cold. And then obviously we need to continue to advocate for these spaces and permanent housing programs that really do benefit the homeless and actually help decrease those numbers. And another reason we need these temporary housing programs or shelters is because finding permanent housing, like caseworkers who are helping find permanent housing for homeless people, it's a process, and you usually can't find something within one day in some of these places, like boarding houses or group homes or even apartment buildings. There's like waiting lists and things like that, so we need those kinds of resources. So learning applied. So I wanted to kind of talk about the coronavirus and how that impacts the middle adult age group specifically. And when you're talking about chronic homelessness, these people tend to age much quicker than they're supposed to. So they'll appear about 10 to 15 years older than they actually are. And not only does it age their appearance, it ages their body as a whole. And because of this, they're now at a higher risk from dying from coronavirus. And so there's actually been, the state of North Carolina has actually rented out a couple of hotels, and this also helps keep jobs there for the hotel staff, because hotel business has been suffering obviously since COVID-19. So the state has rented out these hotels and is putting these high risk people, high risk homeless individuals in these hotels. So the reason that I know this, where I'm getting this from, is my agency actually works with a few of those, and we have some people in those places, and a lot of them have been there since March, and the state is giving, in all these types of hotels that they've rented out, is giving them until the end of December to find a place to go, to find that stable housing. So there's a lot of caseworkers in and out of those places trying to help them do that, and they cannot, I think a majority of those hotels that are rented out, they're not allowed to leave. Like, they are in quarantine this entire time. So that's been a solution that the state has been offering, and that is going to help get a lot of people out of homelessness, because they're going to be able to, they now have a place to lay their head and tend to these needs that they have. And if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I mentioned this before, the lack of shelter is a deficit that they have to focus on surviving all the time, where they can't grow towards these other areas of development that they need to, or it's so hard on their body that they're they're developing far faster than they need to be. So these are the sources that I have, and that is kind of a wrap on my presentation. So thank you for listening.